In the stillness of my opulent Upper Arlington home, I stood at the window, a cup of Earl Grey in hand. The sight of my son, Michael, on the doorstep holding a bouquet of white roses, the same flowers he'd brought to his father's funeral, felt like a cruel joke. He had no idea I had just counted the $3 million his uncle had deposited in my account. The irony wasn't lost on me. He chose flowers that symbolized new beginnings, and this was certainly a fresh start for both of us. A fresh start I had planned meticulously, a week-long strategy to make him pay for stealing my house and leaving his 64-year-old mother to sleep in her car for 2 weeks. Let me back up. My name is Eleanor Vance. Everyone calls me Ellie. 6 months ago, I was a retired kindergarten teacher from Columbus, Ohio, and I thought I was the luckiest mother alive. My late husband, Thomas, and I had paid off our beautiful house in Westerville after 30 years. My pension was comfortable, and my son, Michael, seemed to genuinely care about my well-being. He'd call twice a week, visit every Sunday for dinner, and always insisted on helping with yard work or minor repairs. "Mom, you're getting older," he'd said one evening over pot roast. "What if something happens to you in this big house? What if you fall down the stairs?" His wife, Samantha, nodded sympathetically. "We worry about you living alone, Ellie." Their concern seemed so genuine, so loving. Michael had inherited his father's earnest blue eyes and gentle demeanor. When he looked at me with such worried affection, my heart melted. That's when they presented their solution. "We've been thinking," Samantha said, her voice gentle. "What if we moved in here with you? We could take care of the house, help with everything, and you wouldn't have to worry anymore." Michael leaned forward eagerly. "And Mom, to make it official and protect your assets, we should probably transfer the deed into my name. That way, if anything happens, there won't be any legal complications." I should have seen the red flags. Instead, I saw it as the answer to prayers I hadn't even known I was saying. They moved in that July, and for 6 weeks, it was wonderful. But fairy tales don't last, especially when they're built on lies. The first crack appeared on a sweltering August afternoon when I overheard Michael on the phone in Thomas's old study. "Yeah, the deed transfer went through last month," he was saying. "Once we get her moved out, we can renovate the whole upstairs and probably get $750,000 for it in this market." Moved out. My blood turned to ice water. I stood frozen outside the door. I became a spy in my own home, paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. I noticed how they'd started receiving mail at the house before they moved in. How Samantha had begun rearranging furniture and removing my personal photos. How they'd grown irritated whenever I wanted to use the living room, suggesting I'd be more comfortable upstairs in my bedroom. The second conversation I overheard was even more damning. It was a Tuesday night in early September, and I'd come downstairs for a glass of water. They were in the kitchen, voices low but intense. "She's getting suspicious," Samantha was saying. "Yesterday, she asked me why I was looking at real estate websites." Michael's response made my stomach drop. "We need to move faster then. I'll call Patterson tomorrow about the power of attorney papers." Power of attorney. They weren't just planning to sell my house, they were planning to have me declared incompetent so they could control all my assets. I crept back upstairs and sat on my bed in the dark, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it. I thought about the deed transfer I'd signed so trustingly, believing it was just paperwork to protect my interests. The next morning, I called my own attorney, George Davison, who'd handled Thomas's estate. "George, I need to understand something about my house," I said carefully. "If the deed is in my son's name, but I'm still living here, what are my legal rights?" The silence that followed was longer than I expected. "Eleanor," George said finally, "if the deed is in his name, he owns the house. You're essentially a tenant at will. He could ask you to leave at any time." I hung up and walked through the rooms that suddenly felt foreign. None of it belonged to me anymore. That afternoon, while Michael was at work and Samantha was at her book club, I searched their belongings. In Samantha's jewelry box, I found business cards for 3 different real estate agents. In Michael's desk drawer, I discovered printed emails about home renovation loans and a folder labeled Mom's Finances that contained photocopies of my bank statements going back 2 years. The answer was simple and devastating. He'd been planning this for a very long time. The end came swiftly. 3 days after my discovery, Michael sat me down for what he called a serious conversation about your future, Mom. He prepared a speech. Samantha and I have been talking, he began. And we think it would be best for everyone if you moved into assisted living. There's a really nice place called Sunset Manor that has an opening. I knew the place. It was where my friend Clara had gone when her family decided she was too much trouble to care for at home. Clara had died within 6 months, not from illness, but from a broken heart. I don't need assisted living, I said quietly. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Michael's patronizing smile made my skin crawl. Mom, you're 64 years old. Last week, you left the stove burner on. Yesterday, you couldn't remember where you put your car keys. Both statements were lies. But I didn't bother correcting him. Facts weren't going to matter here. And what happens to this house? I asked. Well, since it's in my name now, we'll probably sell it, Michael said. The money from the sale will help pay for your care. More lies. I had already looked up Sunset Manor's rates online. The remaining money would disappear into Michael and Samantha's renovation dreams and vacation plans. I need some time to think about this, I said finally. 2 days later, I woke up to find all the locks changed. I stood on my own front porch at 7 a.m., still in my nightgown and robe, holding my purse and a small overnight bag. Michael opened the door just wide enough to speak through the gap. I'm sorry, Mom, but this is for your own good, he said. The people from Sunset Manor will be here at 10 to pick you up. There's no point in making a scene. As if a mother expecting to live in her own home was being dramatic. Michael, please, I said, hating how my voice shook. Can we just talk about this? But he was already closing the door. I stood there for 20 minutes, hoping Michael would come to his senses. But the Sunset Manor van pulled up at exactly 10, and I knew my old life was over. The two kind but firm attendants tried to convince me to come peacefully. I looked at my house one last time, at the flower garden Thomas and I had planted together, at the porch swing where I'd read thousands of bedtime stories to Michael when he was small. Then I turned to the attendants and said the words that changed everything. I'm not going with you. Instead, I walked to my Honda Civic, got in, and drove away from the only home I'd known for 33 years. Living in your car teaches you things about yourself you never wanted to know. The constant fear, the shame, the physical discomfort. I wasn't poor. Not really. I had my pension, Social Security, and about $40,000 in savings, but without an address, I couldn't access most of it. Everything in modern life assumes you have a place to call home. On day 14, at the public library where I spent most of my days, I saw an email from an address I didn't recognize, j.vance@gmail.com. The subject line read, Eleanor, your brother John. My heart stopped. I hadn't spoken to my brother, John, in 3 years. We'd grown apart, partly due to geography and partly because his success in commercial real estate development had always made me feel inadequate. The email was short. Eleanor, I heard through the grapevine what happened with Michael and the house. I'm flying into Columbus tomorrow morning. Meet me at the Hilton downtown at noon. We need to talk. Your brother, who should have called sooner, John. The next day, I arrived at the Hilton at exactly noon. John was waiting in the lobby, and I barely recognized him. When he saw me, his face cracked with an expression I couldn't quite read. Jesus, Eleanor, he said quietly, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive cologne and success. What has that little bastard done to you? I had planned to be strong, but feeling my brother's arms around me for the first time in years broke something loose inside me. I started crying right there in the fancy hotel lobby and couldn't seem to stop. After I told him everything, he was quiet for a long moment. You know, I made some money over the years, he said finally. What you probably don't know is that I've been watching Michael for a while. Not spying exactly, but paying attention. He's always struck me as entitled. John reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. I own 17 rental properties in Columbus, he said. One of them just became available this morning. He slid the envelope across the table. The keys are in there along with the deed. The house is yours, free and clear. Consider it back payment for all the Christmas presents I never sent. I stared at the envelope. John, I can't accept. Yes, you can, he interrupted. But that's not all. He pulled out a second envelope. There's also a cashier's check in there. $3 million. I don't understand, I whispered. John smiled. I'm 66 years old, Eleanor. My money is going to go to someone when I die, and I'd rather see what happens when I give it to you while I'm alive to enjoy watching. He leaned forward. Michael thinks he's so clever, doesn't he? Thinks he played you perfectly. Wait until he finds out his homeless mother just became a millionaire. The house John gave me was in Upper Arlington, one of Columbus's most prestigious neighborhoods. It was a 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath with a kitchen that belonged in a home design magazine. It was twice the size of the house I'd shared with Thomas, and 100 times more luxurious than anywhere I'd ever imagined living. The most satisfying part was setting up my new financial situation. John had recommended a wealth management firm, and I learned that with conservative investments, I could easily live on $200,000 per year without touching the principal. The irony was delicious. While he was renovating my old house to flip it for maybe $700,000 in profit, I was sitting on enough money to buy 10 houses just like it. But I was still the same Eleanor Vance who taught kindergarten for 30 years. I couldn't just sit in my beautiful house spending money aimlessly. I needed a purpose, a plan. It started when I drove past my old house one afternoon. I noticed the expensive cars in the driveway, Michael's BMW and Samantha's Range Rover. They were spending money they hadn't even made yet, so confident in their real estate flip that they were already living like people who'd struck it rich. That's when I realized Michael had made a crucial error. He'd assumed that getting rid of me meant he'd won. He had no idea that his desperate homeless mother had not only landed on her feet but had landed in luxury beyond his wildest dreams. He also had no idea what was coming for him. I drove home and opened my laptop, spending the rest of the evening researching everything I could find about my son's finances. What I discovered made my new plan even sweeter. Michael and Samantha weren't just living beyond their means. They were drowning in debt. They needed my house to sell quickly and for top dollar, or they were going to be in serious financial trouble. I smiled. Michael thought he'd been so clever manipulating his naive old mother, but he'd forgotten something important about teachers. We're very, very good at long-term planning. And I was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. 3 weeks into my new life as a secret millionaire, I was having coffee with my neighbor Janet when she casually mentioned that she had run into Michael, and he was telling people how worried he'd been about me since I moved into the assisted living facility. The narrative was so perfect, so believable that even Janet, who'd known me for 15 years, had accepted it without question. That afternoon, I called a private investigator John had recommended. Patricia Reynolds was a sharp-eyed woman who specialized in financial fraud cases. I hired her to investigate my son's business dealings. 2 weeks later, she called with a report that exceeded my wildest expectations. Your son is in deep financial trouble, she began. He and his wife have $700,000 in debt spread across 14 different credit cards and loans. They need that house to sell for at least $800,000 or they're looking at bankruptcy within 6 months. But that wasn't the most interesting part. The renovation work on your old house. They're cutting corners in ways that could be dangerous. Unlicensed electrical work, unpermitted plumbing changes. If the right person reported this to the city. She let the implication hang in the air. I thanked Patricia and hung up. Michael wasn't just greedy and cruel. He was desperate and stupid. He'd put himself in a position where he needed everything to go perfectly, with no room for error or bad luck. How unfortunate it would be if his luck took a turn for the worse. The anonymous tip I called into the Columbus building department was made from a payphone. 3 days later, I drove by to see a city truck parked in my old driveway and 2 officials with clipboards walking around the property. Through my new car's tinted windows, I watched Michael standing on the front porch, his face red with what I assumed was a combination of anger and panic. The building department citation arrived at Michael's workplace a few days later. The violations were extensive. All work had to stop immediately until the violations were resolved. The construction crews disappeared overnight. The coming soon real estate sign was quietly removed. That Friday evening, instead of going to their usual restaurant, Michael and Samantha stayed home. I parked across the street and watched through their lit windows as what appeared to be a very heated argument unfolded in my former living room. I wondered if they were finally realizing that their carefully planned financial crime was falling apart. The next morning, I received a call that made my week. It was George Davison with news about my legal research. "Eleanor, I've been looking into the circumstances of your deed transfer," he said. "If we can prove that you were coerced or that Michael misrepresented the documents, we might have grounds for a lawsuit. More importantly, we might be able to void the transfer entirely." Void the transfer. The words were beautiful. Michael could spend all the money he wanted renovating the house, could take on all the debt he needed, and in the end, I could potentially reclaim legal ownership and leave him holding nothing but a pile of unpaid bills. But that felt almost too easy, too clean. He deserved something more creative, more personal, more devastating. The first sign that Michael was cracking came through Janet, who'd seen him at the hardware store looking haggard. According to her gossip network, he was having money problems. The building permit delays had cost him 2 months of construction time and around $50,000 in rework and inspection fees. His credit cards were maxed out, he'd borrowed against his 401k, and he'd even taken out a title loan against his BMW. The most delicious detail was that he had already signed a contract with a buyer, contingent on the renovation work being completed by December 1st. Finishing by then was looking increasingly impossible. Meanwhile, I was living my best life. I joined a book club, started taking piano lessons, and was planning a trip to Italy for the spring. Every morning, I woke up in my beautiful house and remembered that I was free in ways I'd never been before. But freedom, I was learning, also meant the freedom to be absolutely ruthless when the situation called for it. Which is why when Michael finally reached out to me, I was ready. The call came on a Thursday evening in early November. "Mom." His voice sounded strained. "I know things have been complicated, but I think there's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" "The thing is, Mom, there are some problems with the house renovation, and I was wondering if you might help us financially with some of the unexpected costs." Help them financially. The audacity was breathtaking. The son who'd made me homeless was calling to ask for money. "I'm living in assisted living on a fixed income," I said gently. "I don't have $50,000. It wasn't technically a lie. I didn't have $50,000. I had $3 million. But Michael didn't need to know that. "Mom, you have to understand. If this house renovation fails, Samantha and I could lose everything. Our cars, our credit, maybe even our jobs if we have to declare bankruptcy. You're my mother. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" And there it was. The same manipulation he'd used to get me to sign over the deed. The same emotional blackmail. "Michael," I said quietly, "I think you should come visit me. We should have this conversation in person." He agreed immediately, probably thinking he'd have better luck manipulating me face to face. He was walking straight into the final act of a play I'd been directing for months. Saturday couldn't come soon enough. Saturday morning, I received a call. That changed everything. It was Patricia Reynolds with information so explosive I had to sit down while she explained it. "Eleanor, you need to know something else about your son's financial situation. Michael took out a construction loan using fraudulent income statements. He claimed he was making twice his actual salary. Bank fraud. There's more," Patricia continued. "I found records showing he's been forging your signature on documents even after you moved out. He's been taking cash advances on credit cards opened in your name, using your old address as the contact information. Identity theft, forgery. If you reported this to the authorities, Michael would be looking at serious federal charges. Mail fraud, identity theft, bank fraud. We're talking about potential prison time." At exactly 2 p.m., my doorbell rang. I had dressed carefully for this moment, choosing clothes that looked respectable but not expensive. When I opened the door, Michael was standing there holding a bouquet of white roses. His face was thinner than I remembered, and there were dark circles under his eyes that told the story of sleepless nights and mounting desperation. "Hi, Mom," he said, offering the flowers with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You look good. Assisted living seems to be agreeing with you." I accepted the roses without comment and invited him in, watching his face as he took in my living space for the first time. His mouth literally fell open as he looked around my elegant living room with its marble fireplace and expensive furnishings. "Mom," he said slowly. "This doesn't look like assisted living. This looks like..." He trailed off, unable to process what he was seeing. "Like what, Michael?" I asked pleasantly, settling into my favorite armchair. "This looks like a millionaire's house," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled and reached for the tea service I'd prepared, while Michael stood frozen in the middle of my living room. "Michael," I said calmly. "We need to talk about those credit cards you've been opening in my name, and the construction loan you've fraudulently obtained using fake income statements, and the $200,000 you've stolen from me over the past 8 months. The white roses fell from his nerveless fingers and scattered across my Persian rug like snow. The silence stretched between us. "How could you possibly know all that?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Because, Michael," I said quietly, "I'm not the helpless old woman you thought you were manipulating. I'm not living in assisted living. I'm not struggling on a fixed income." I stood up and walked to the window. "Would you like to know where I've been living since you locked me out of my own house? Would you like to know how I went from homeless to living in a house worth more than yours in the span of 6 weeks? I turned back to face him. "Your Uncle John gave me this house, Michael. Free and clear. No mortgage, no strings attached. He also gave me $3 million to start over with." I watched all the color drain from his face. $3 million, Michael. More money than you'll make in your entire lifetime, even if you manage to avoid prison. Prison? The word came out as barely a whisper. Bank fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, forgery. According to my attorney, you're looking at potentially 15 to 20 years in federal prison, not to mention complete financial ruin. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice hollow. "What do I want?" I repeated thoughtfully. "I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything that matters to you. I want you to know what it's like to be betrayed by the person you trusted most in the world. I want you to experience the kind of helplessness and desperation you forced me to live with." I closed the manila folder with Patricia's report and smiled. "The good news, Michael, is that I'm not going to send you to prison. I'm not going to call the FBI or press charges or destroy your life the way you tried to destroy mine." His face flooded with relief so profound I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "The bad news," I continued, "is that I'm also not going to help you. Not with money, not with loans, not with anything. You're going to face the consequences of your choices all by yourself, just like you forced me to do. Your house renovation will fail. You'll lose your buyer. You'll face bankruptcy, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself." I stood up and walked to the front door, opening it wide. "Those are beautiful roses, Michael. White roses for new beginnings. How fitting. This is definitely a new beginning for both of us. The difference is, mine includes $3 million and the most beautiful house in Upper Arlington. Yours includes bankruptcy, professional ruin, and the knowledge that the mother you threw away like garbage is living better than you ever will." He stumbled to his feet and walked toward the door like a man in a trance. When he reached the threshold, he turned back one more time. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said. And for the first time since he'd arrived, his voice sounded like the little boy I'd once loved unconditionally. "I know you are, Michael," I replied gently. "You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry your plan failed. You're sorry you underestimated me. But you're not sorry you tried to destroy me, because if you had succeeded, you'd be celebrating right now instead of apologizing." I closed the door and locked it, then returned to my living room, where the scattered white roses were the only evidence that my son had ever been there at all. I watched him drive away in his BMW, probably for the last time before the bank repossessed it. Then I called John to tell him the good news. Michael's lesson was complete, and justice had finally been served. This story ends with a choice. Eleanor chose justice over mercy, and she found peace in that decision. Now it's your turn to choose. Did Eleanor do the right thing? Should she have sent Michael to prison? What would you have done with $3 million? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the complex choices we face in life.